Hi there and welcome to this special episode of OGV Energy Let's Talk Transition. I'm Murray Milhuish, the founder of Anik Consulting. We help businesses in the energy transition. And if you're interested in growing your business, get in touch to find out how. Now, I said this was a special episode. It's episode number 21, the big coming of age. And boy, what a show we've got for you today. Our guest today is responsible for driving the energy transition in Scotland. Scotland's got an interesting place in the energy transition. It's already delivering 13.6 gigawatts of renewable energy. The Scotland round of offshore wind alone, which of course we've covered on the show already, has the potential to generate almost 28 gigawatts on its own. That's nearly tripling the total amount of renewable electricity in Scotland. So let's find out more. Our guest today grew up in the northeast of Scotland. She ran her own video production company before creating safety training for industry. She then became a member of the Scottish Parliament, and in March 2023 she became Energy and Environment Minister. Gillian Martin, Scottish Energy and Environment Minister, welcome to the show.
Hi Murray, it's good to be here.
Hi, thanks for being here. First of all, how do we address you? You're the first government minister we've had on the show.
Oh, Gillian, please.
Brilliant.
Yeah, Miss Martin is someone else. That's my daughter. I'm Gillian.
Thank you, Gillian. Tell me, can you introduce yourself and your department, please?
So I guess it depends how much you want to know. In terms of the ministerial job that I've got since March, I was Minister for Energy for about 8 weeks, and then I got Environment put on top of it as well. So I have got responsibility for energy consenting and I guess of liaising with the sector on how we're actually doing our just transition in energy and everything around that, and sort of skills breaks into it too. But on the environmental side, I also have things like other people who might be working in the marine environment are in my portfolio too. So I've got like offshore wind on the energy side, but I also have responsibility for things like inshore fisheries.
Right, okay.
You know, which might seem a wee bit kind of like bizarre, a mix, but actually is really, really important because that's going to be, it's basically going to share in the same space. I have responsibilities in the environment for animal welfare as well. But energy was the first job that the First Minister gave me, and I was delighted to get it because coming from the northeast and having a little bit of background in it myself, I thought it was very much a good gig for me.
Great. And what is the government's vision for the energy transition?
The vision for the energy transition is effectively decarbonising our energy production as much as possible in a managed way, using the vast natural resources that Scotland's got to power that. I hope that I'm right and saying that internationally we are viewed at having a fantastic potential in doing that. There were already sort of like quite quick movers on things like floating offshore wind in particular. The rest of the world is looking to us to see how that develops. We have got incredible resources that are largely untapped at the moment in wave and tidal as well. And of course, we can't forget we've got hydro capacity as well, off the back of a decades-long oil and gas sector, which is still very much operational, but has an awful lot of the skills and expertise that is going to take us into the next wave and through the energy transition as we go towards, I guess, our net zero targets of 2045. But with the backdrop of the fact that we need to maintain our energy security at the same time.
And these are quite ambitious targets, aren't they? And I'm keen to know, Gillian, how do you propose to ensure they're met?
Well, I guess the most important thing is actually listening to the sectors and seeing where the challenges lie, and seeing what government can do, because obviously in energy a lot of it is going to be propelled by who invests in what and who bids for whatever licenses that this is. So I think we've got ScotWind, and I imagine you know an awful lot about that. ScotWind's probably the biggest commercial round of offshore wind licenses, certainly in the UK, and it has got the potential to be delivering 28 gigawatts. We have got the INTOG round, which will actually happen before ScotWind, which is going to be used by the oil and gas industry to reduce their emissions by electrifying fields and platforms as well. And I guess it's from the government's point of view, obviously, we working with the Crown Estate, we actually sort of put out those options. They've been very successful, an awful lot of big players partnering with smaller players and those relationships forging, and they're actually applying for those licenses. I guess my job is looking at how long the consents will take for various things, particularly onshore wind as well, and making sure that we can do whatever the government can to make that as seamless as possible, to look at where the log jams are happening there, to manage expectations of communities as well as that happens, because there's an awful lot of infrastructure going to be have to put in place to take all this renewable power, all this renewable electricity that we know we can generate, but actually getting it into the grid or getting it to some kind of fruition, whether it's hydrogen or whether it's into the grid itself. I think it's also my job to be advocating on what needs to happen at UK level for that to happen too. Scottish Government, doesn't have a lot of the powers in this area, particularly addressing all the grid problems, the contracts for difference, for example. So we have to be effectively lobbying those that do have the powers alongside the sectors to be making sure that this fantastic amount of renewable energy that we're going to be generating actually finds its way to market in a way that also benefits communities in Scotland.
Great. And in terms of those communities, what's the government's role in terms of the relationship between the projects and the communities, and how does it support that part of the energy transition?
I think it's about almost being the conduit between the people applying for licenses, the big developers, and feeding back what we're hearing from communities about the responsible development that they have and the obligations that they have. I'm very interested in how we can look at enhancing the offer of community benefits. Particularly, we've got quite big projects that are going to be putting cabling throughout close to quite a few communities in rural areas. And the developers that are going to be doing that have to do that in a responsible way, but they also have to be involving communities very early on, but they also have to be given back to those communities. Now, I would say that traditionally it has been a little bit of a, here's some money to paint your scout hut, but there's only so many times that you can paint that scout hut. Maybe the outreach has been, how can I put this? It's been, there's certain people within communities that are maybe the loudest voices about how that could get used. But those communities on the whole, in those rural areas, are probably the most fuel poor in the whole of the UK. In fact, there's no probably about it. They are the most fuel poor. They have some of the sort of hardest to heat homes. They have some of the highest gas and electricity bills. You'll see that they actually, a lot of people have moved into extreme fuel poverty as well. How do these developers engage those people so that when they're offering community benefits, it's maybe having a positive impact on those people's actual day-to-day existence? What offer can they be making to perhaps make their homes warmer, maybe make their homes more sustainable? How could they maybe be supporting some community energy schemes? Lots of ideas. So I see myself very much, I have fuel poverties in my portfolio as well. So yes, I am engaging with the sector that's actually going to be delivering and planning all these big infrastructure projects. But I'm also on the side of people who are actually wanting to see something change in their day-to-day existence, and never more so than in the last year.
Okay, and that's at quite a local community level, which is great. But how do you foresee the energy transition affecting Scotland's economy?
So it's got massive potential, and we need to make sure that we harness that potential as much as possible. And that may sound like a glib thing to say, but if you know anything about my background, I'll tell you the story of why I care about a just transition so much, because it's actually very personal to me. In the 1970s, I am an Aberdonian because of a lack of just transition. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I like being an Aberdonian, but effectively my family were from Clydebank. My father was a planning engineer at John Brown's shipyard, and the reason that he had to uproot his family and take them to the other side of Scotland, and it was a very big deal at the time. It was, tears were shed. We left grandparents behind and whatever in the 1970s, was because the shipyards, my father saw the writing on the wall, changed jobs, initially went offshore, and then decided that the future for the family lay in Aberdeenshire. And we moved up initially to Inverurie and then to Newborough. And looking at a lot of my father's workmates and friends that he'd worked alongside with in John Brown's, a lot of those guys actually never worked again. They certainly never worked in engineering again. There's vast skills that they had were never utilised. Many of them emigrated. A few of them emigrated to Canada in particular. And the scars of that lack of just transition are in those communities in the same way that they're in the mining communities, the steel communities in more central Scotland. And if we don't have a just transition for the massive oil and gas industry that has served Scotland and the UK very, very well, in the UK in particular in terms of tax receipts, if we do not manage this transition in a responsible way that takes people with us, that recognises the vast amount of skills that oil and gas workers have got, particularly in the supply chain, then we are repeating the mistakes of the past, and we would never be forgiven for that. And this is a joint effort. This is not just about the Scottish Government, it's about the UK Government. But I see myself very much as a sort of like an advocate for a reminder of many Scottish families who a just transition didn't happen for before. So it can't be the same in my watch.
That's good to hear. And one thing that I found very interesting about this podcast and all the brilliant guests I've had on is just how many have mentioned just how important those skills are that were learned in the oil and gas industry and how they're now being applied, whether it's offshore wind or offshore wave. And that is, extremely encouraging and interesting to learn. So.
A lot of the kit's going to be the same. A lot of the procedures around the engineering is going to be the same. A lot of the skills, particularly in subsea, are going to be the same. It's going to be working in hostile environments. Oil and gas workers have been working in hostile environments and getting the oil and gas ashore for decades now. They will be able to pivot. And I think also we need to stop talking about oil and gas as one sector over here and renewables over here. It's energy. It's all energy. And if we get this right, and I hope very much that we do, we will have individuals working within the energy sector, and they'll be doing one project for renewables, and then when that's finished, they might be doing a little bit of work on oil and gas, and that'll probably be continuing for quite a number of years. And their skills will be transferable, not just in a kind of a one-off, I'm moving to renewables type situation. They'll be back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And that's how the population, not just of the northeast, but actually across Scotland, because it's not just the northeast that generates energy. It's across the whole of Scotland that we'll have an agile workforce.
Great. And Gillian, you mentioned earlier local communities and Scotland as well. And of course, each one of those Scotland developers has to publish regular updates on their supply chain involvement. But how do we ensure the local content is maximised, and what teeth does the government have to hold those projects to account?
So this is probably one of my favourite aspects of what the government has done in the ScotWind round, is that we have actually made it compulsory for a certain amount of local content and actually to be involved in the local supply chain as well. It's part of the condition of the licences that were given out. But you know what, even if it wasn't, I think there's a recognition amongst the developers. They're already working in this area already, a lot of them. And they know that the skilled workforce that they need is here already. The supply chain, the world-class supply chain that we've had for oil and gas, which has grown out of, the opportunity that oil and gas has presented to the Northeast, that you have had, quite a lot of people that were maybe even involved in like agriculture initially, like, their fathers were maybe running farms, they were maybe involved in fishing, whatever, and they pivoted to be in the supply chain for oil and gas. They'll pivot again, and they'll pivot between the two for a long time. I was in Donegal last week and talking about like net zero and about our just transition. And I was met with, I would say, admiration, first of all, but almost envy of what we've got here in terms of the actual existing supply chain and what Scotland is doing. And it was mentioned quite a few times to me, like, we have got it all on our doorstep already in a way that Ireland doesn't. They've got very stretching targets too in terms of reaching net zero, but they don't have the same natural resources as us, and they also don't have the supply chain sitting on our doorstep, and they were very envious of that. So we can't take that for granted. We need to utilise that as much as possible.
And Gillian, what's the Scottish Government doing as a whole to ensure that businesses with the potential to join that supply chain have every opportunity to do so?
Well, we're having conversations right throughout this process with the developers of this, about how they're actually reaching out and actually looking at ways in which we can maybe... There's already things in train. I mean, talking about onshore wind, they've already got like portals where people go in. I would actually like to see that there's a situation where we've got an energy portal. We've got a single interface. Because of what I've talked about in terms of this pivoting of workers, whatever, you'll be able to go into an actual individual portal for energy, whether you're a supply chain, whether you're an individual worker. And we've been having conversations with stakeholders around that, and everyone seems to think, this is something that we really could be working on. There's models of that happening already. But as we go forward into Scotland, and also INTOG's almost going to be the kind of like the sort of trailer, the precursor for quite a lot of this. We get INTOG to work, which is obviously smaller in terms of the volume of developments, but that's going to happen first. So if you evolve the supply chain at this point, and then it'll have to grow and grow and grow as we go forward to Scotland. But I think we have to sort of like stop siloing everything, supply chain, individual workers, projects, developers all have to be sort of like in the same kind of interface, and almost like there's no wrong path to where you want to go. But the developers also they've been doing road shows. They've been inviting supply chain for oil and gas or for any kind of like sector to actually come and speak to them about where their developments might take them and how they might be able to get involved and win contracts for those developments. And that engagement, I see that happening all the time already, and I'm confident that it's going to build and build and build.
Gillian, what's your view on skills passporting? And specifically, I'm thinking of, for example, the Global Wind Organization accreditation, and we've got a situation where somebody can go offshore to an oil and gas platform with an oil and gas medical, but it's not considered sufficient for the offshore wind industry because it's not a GWO medical.
So 2 years ago, I, as a backbencher, did a survey of oil and gas workers and asked them if they had tried to transition into renewables, and asked them to tell me about their experiences. And it was a very kind of qualitative type survey that I put out there. I didn't want graphs, I didn't want to make a report. It was just about X amount of this and X amount of that, had done this and X amount had done that. I wanted it to be experiences. And this issue about the skills passport was the number one thing. We need to recognise that in a lot of cases, in the majority of cases, people working in oil and gas that are wanting to transition to renewables who've got these skills are paying for their certification and their training themselves, and can, rightly so, very, very distressed when they're having to double up on the competencies. They've already done that for oil and gas. Why are they doing exactly the same thing but with a different badge and then paying a couple of grand out of their own money for? So I think the energy skills passport idea, there's no longer an idea. I've actually seen a working model of it. I've seen it actually working. It's amazing. I think that this is going to be an absolute game changer. Now, what that's actually going to require is trust amongst the various sectors. Trust, GWO from a PITO, to be working together, to be actually like thrashing out how they're going to share their data, how they're going to basically all invest in this. It means that offshore wind operators will be able to trust the competencies that are got from a PITO, or PITO, oil and gas will be able to trust the competencies that come from GWO. There'll be skills mapping across the piece. And when it comes to fruition, it's a when, as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, government aren't involved. Government have given money towards it, but we're not actually in charge of the rolling out of this. We are leaving that to the industry to have all those negotiations and sort that out. That's going to be a game changer for the workforce. It has to happen. It's so wasteful otherwise. And to be honest, it's actually not very fair. It's wasting a lot of people's time and a lot of people's money.
Duplicating a lot of cost, and it's completely unnecessary.
Yes, absolutely agree.
Good to hear. What's the rough timescale then on rolling that out?
I think by the end of the year, is what I've been told is that the sort of like, I suppose, a sort of consortium of stakeholders involved in that are hoping to have something rolled out by the end of the year. It's not easy though. I mean, it really isn't easy, because you have got sectors that have got their own standards and their own courses and their own way of doing things, having to come together and then make agreements. And I just don't think it's not as straightforward as perhaps people thought. But the end result, once they get it done, is going to be, as I say, an absolute game changer.
Well, do you know, I'm delighted to hear that. You know, when I was a partner in an ROV business, it was something that used to wind me up incessantly when our guys needed different accreditation to work in oil and gas than offshore wind. It always seemed completely unnecessary, so I'm delighted that it's being addressed. Now, if I may, I'd like to turn to storage of renewable energy. Can you give us a flavour for the government's involvement, and how is it looking to achieve the storage of all of this renewable energy?
Well, I think there's two things. It's like when renewable electricity doesn't have a place to go because our grid infrastructure really needs to be invested in, particularly by the UK government, and there needs to be an overhaul and a massive increase of capacity. There is the opportunity to store it, but there's also the opportunity to make hydrogen from it. So I guess we're looking at both those things together, and a lot of the storage aspect of things is happening in the innovation space. I've actually already visited quite a few companies that I'm absolutely blown away by, that seem to have cracked, from my view anyway, seems to have cracked a lot of this. The companies like Invinity in Bathgate are using vanadium instead of lithium for their batteries. They were able to tell me about how they're actually going to be able to sort of like roll out these battery storage. They're actually like they're almost like washing machine type compartments, and they stack on top of each other. And I'm tremendously excited about what they are doing in that space. There's other battery storage people, but at the same time, whoever cracks the storage of renewable electricity is the next Bill Gates, as far as I'm concerned. That is really the kind of step change in this. In terms of solution of generating all this power with nowhere to go. Recrack battery storage. And I'm seeing the seeds, not just the seeds of that, I'm seeing that starting to happen in Scotland. The other aspect of things is converting it into hydrogen, which I'm also tremendously excited about. We're recording this in the Aberdeen area today, and we already have a situation in Aberdeen where they're already investing money, both a partnership with the City Council and BP in Hydrogen Hub. The local authority are using that hydrogen to power quite a lot of their fleets. They're using it to power local buses as well. They've had visits from Belfast City Council, Bristol City Council, asking them how they did it, and I think that kind of procurement power of local authorities, who also have their own. They have got their own kind of targets that they have to meet in terms of decarbonisation of what they're doing. They're looking to where that's been done already in Aberdeen City, and they're starting. So I think we could have a situation where we have got hydrogen hubs all over Scotland. You see it already in Orkney. For a long time, they didn't have anywhere for a lot of that energy to go because of the lack of connection to the mainland. They have decided to use that and to create hydrogen. And as the technology evolves, we're going to have smaller electrolyzers. We're going to have hubs. We could have hubs across the whole of Scotland. If we've got investment from public investment into that technology and actual use for where that hydrogen goes, that will mean that the cost of it will eventually start to come down. And we might even see a situation where we have more sort of like private users actually, instead of buying an electric vehicle, they might actually start thinking about buying a hydrogen vehicle because those hubs exist. We have one private hydrogen car individual owner in Aberdeen. Who knows, in 10 years' time, we could have many because we'll have those hydrogen hubs as well. So it's about storage. It's about three things. It's about getting that electricity into the grid, okay? We do not hold all the cards in that area, but we can't wait for other people to wake up to that. So what do we do with it meanwhile? We need to find storage solutions, and we need to find other uses for it. And I've just exemplified hopefully two of those that we're excited about.
Brilliant. And Gillian, tell me, what are the long-term opportunities for pumped hydro?
Yeah, so I am making a visit next week to Cruachan to talk about just that. It's something that my predecessor, Michael Matheson, was extremely excited about as well, about the opportunity there. We personally feel that they've maybe not been given a lot of the incentives that other types of I suppose, low emissions electricity has had in the past. I think we've also got the capacity to look at how actual individual communities can have their own energy schemes in hydro as well. I was visiting one down in Dumfries just the other day. The red tape involved in them actually getting to that point, and the effort involved and the volunteers that are given their time is substantial. We need to look at how we sort of bring down that barriers in terms of everything a community needs to know in order to get that off the ground, and actually funding them. We need to make it easier, because cumulatively, if we had more pump storage hydro happening, even like small stations throughout, you look at how many streams, rivers we've got in Scotland, cumulatively that could actually be a major source. Again, it's another issue about getting into the grid. That is a bit of a stumbling block at the moment. So we have to continue to advocate for easier access to the grid, not just in pump storage hydro, but for things like solar as well.
I'd like to touch on grid issues in a second, but just to stay on the pumped hydro for a second, the Scottish Government recently called on the UK Government to support pumped hydro. Yes. Why is that necessary?
I think it comes back to what I said. Otherwise, it's a natural resource that's out there that we don't feel has had the actual support in the way that other technologies have had. We don't think it's a particularly level playing field. But it's like in the same way that our wind is our natural resource, oil and gas is a natural resource, our waterways are a natural resource as well that could be generating electricity. And there's massive, we're not even touching the sides of the potential that we have in that area. And when you look at energy security, wind is going to be generating and then it'll be intermittent. Solar will be generating, it's intermittent. Hydro, pretty much a steady flow of electricity. Okay, notwithstanding, as water levels rise and fall, but on the whole. And we often sort of those of us who are evangelical about wind power in particular often get the accusation of, well, what about when the wind doesn't blow? Well, when the wind doesn't blow in Scotland, we've always got hydro in the background. Do we have enough at the moment? No, we don't. And that's where we fill in the gaps. So more support for that is a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
Great. And offshore wave and tidal developers often point out that their homegrown technologies are capable of adding significant value and exports. and actually create more jobs per megawatt than offshore wind. What's being done to support offshore wind and offshore wave and tidal?
Well, I guess that SDI are obviously involved in a lot of that. Scottish Enterprise and the various enterprise agencies are involved with supporting some of those more kind of, I hesitate to use the word nascent technologies, but they are in the scheme of things compared to something like wind power. They are still very much at the early stage. I was meeting with people that are working in the subsea sector, in renewables in particular, in the supply chain, and there was a chap there that's involved in has a company involved in wave technology. And he was telling me how that with his technology can almost like bolt onto a wind turbine. So it's actually generating electricity subsea, as well as this wind turbine, which is owned by another operator. So it's a case of, I think I see a role of our enterprise agencies in supporting that technology, but also partnering them with other people that are working in the marine space, because there's so many different applications for this. And as you rightly pointed out, the exporting of that expertise could really be quite significant in terms of climate justice, for example. So if we are proving it in Scotland, we could be exporting our expertise in wave and tidal technology to other parts of the world who finding it very difficult to decarbonise, but are also at the front line in terms of actually the effects of climate change as well. So that could be something that we could be doing in the kind of like that space as well, around like climate justice. So we need to be I think our enterprise agencies are absolutely getting this. In order to actually find the next big thing, you need to take some risks. You need to sort of like allow people to try new things, to come with you with innovative things, to give them that sort of like seed funding, but to be relaxed when some things pay off and some things don't, because that's just how innovation works. So wave and tidal aren't quite at the same stage as like floating offshore wind, whatever, but could they be? Yes. And there's a responsibility of the government and our enterprise agencies to help them do that. Absolutely.
And Gillian, you mentioned earlier on around grid issues. Can you give us a flavour for what the Scottish Government is doing to enable the transmission and connection of all of these renewable sources?
Well, that's a really tricky question, because we really, other than, I suppose, lobbying Ofgem and the UK government to make that investment, but also lobbying them around the kind of, I guess, the inequity that there is there at the moment in the contracts for difference, for example, various market pricing mechanisms that seem to have electricity pegged to the price of gas. All those things that the sectors are saying about the lack of access, the queuing system to get onto the grid in the first place, and against certain people that have actually, they're in that queue but they're not using it, they're not using their capacity that they've been given. Reform of that whole system and the investment into the grid so we have a much bigger capacity, particularly in Scotland, which is going to be generating renewable electricity that's going to be exported to the whole of the UK. Standing shoulders to shoulder with the sectors that are making the same arguments that we are, because I keep on coming back to that. I wish we had the powers in that area. Obviously, I'm in the flavour of party that wants all the powers, but until that is the case, that we need to be lobbying very strongly with the sector, who are saying exactly the same thing as the Scottish Government in this area, and keeping on. And if they can ignore the Scottish Government for political reasons, but they can't ignore the sector. But also, I keep on coming back to this point as well, and everything I say around the UK government, they've got targets too. And they know that if Scotland doesn't meet our 2045 target, then they will not meet their 2050 target. So it is a very real issue for them too.
Yeah, so essentially you agree that we need a use it or lose it attitude towards the grid connections for these renewable sources. Yes. Great, good to hear. Now, Gillian, Scotland seems to have this huge opportunity to become a major exporter of renewable energy. And of course, the closest market would be England. But what's being done to encourage export to our European neighbours, for example?
Well, my colleague Angus Robertson is pretty much doing this quite a lot in terms of all his engagement that he has with his like European partners, particularly the sort of like big industrial countries that are looking to decarbonise. So hydrogen is a big part of that. Actually looking at, I mean, obviously we want a situation where when we're generating hydrogen, we want to be using that domestically as much as possible for the reasons that I've said and some of the examples that I've given you. But we also have a massive opportunity to be exporting our hydrogen that we have the capacity, the potential to generate, particularly to places like Germany, who already, I mean, again, I mentioned I was in Donegal, they're talking about hydrogen too, where Scotland can almost be a kind of like a stop-off point for this hydrogen coming through our existing pipelines, repurposed pipelines for hydrogen through Scotland and then out the other side and into continental Europe. This cannot be done by Scottish Government alone. We're talking about the infrastructure is going to be extremely costly. So I think it's a case of like Scottish Government partnering with private investors and those that see the potential as well for the export, the capital that they are going to generate as a result of that export as well, and having a really can-do attitude to that, because we know that there's a market out there for it. You know, so how do we partner with these private investors to get that infrastructure in place so that when Scotland is generating it at scale, that we're able to get it to mainland Europe? Because I think we're looking at, even if Ireland was generating their potential and Scotland was generating our potential, it still wouldn't be enough to satisfy the demand that there is for Germany.
Yes. Great. And how about electrical interconnectors? Are we going to see some more of those direct from Scotland over to
I hope
Europe?
so. I hope so. But again, this is not something that the Scottish Government can do on its own. And I think it makes geographical sense for those interconnectors to come from the south of Scotland. Whether it politically makes sense to some of our UK opponents is another matter. We saw that happen with carbon capture and storage. So there's the political dimension as well, but I think it makes economic sense and it makes geographical sense for the more interconnectors to be happening coming from the south of Scotland into mainland Europe.
And when you say political factors, you mean that the UK government would rather those interconnectors were with England and not with Scotland?
Well, you'll have to ask them, but that's certainly the impression I get.
Well, do you know, I might just do that. So, Gillian, you know, in each show we ask our guests about success because we really want to get to know the people who are leading the energy transition. So how is success defined for your department, first of all?
What success would look like in the energy sphere, as far as I'm concerned, would be no dips in capacity for generating energy. So no cliff edges, individuals and workforces able to pivot and move seamlessly between all the different energies sectors that all kind of like come together as one, and that young people in Scotland and particularly in the northeast, I'm going to be a little bit parochial, will see going into the energy industry as being a lifetime career that's going to be sustainable in Scotland, and they will make that decision based on the government's ability with the partners and the stakeholders to have a managed transition. And success to me personally would look like the opposite of what my father experienced in Clydebank.
Yes, and of course I'm going to take that opportunity just to say that we are organising a recruitment event for the energy transition on the 8th of November in Edinburgh. So hopefully we can get as many people involved as possible. Now, turning back to success, Gillian, how do you define success for yourself personally?
Gosh, I guess success for me would look like, in all the engagements I have with the various sectors that I have to work with, that people would say she gets it, and she understands it, and she's doing something to overcome the challenges. It would be a reputational success.
Great.
I think that politicians' reputation is their measure of success. Obviously, winning in ballot boxes when you go for your re-election is that success. But for me, as Energy Minister, it's about what would keep me going and what would put a smile on my face is if people actually listen to what I've got to say on energy, and it meant that I get what the challenges are, and I'm doing my best to overcome those challenges as much as government can.
Great. And Gillian, what advice would you give to your younger self if you had that opportunity just now?
Do more science.
Do more science.
I've ended up in energy by a really circuitous route. Mm-hmm. So I, very, very left brain person, very, very good at the kind of like, the creative stuff, and went into television and video production, but ended up in the energy sector because that's where quite a lot of the work was. So I ended up making safety videos. I ended up writing safety courses for people, and I actually found that I really, really enjoyed that. And actually the creative part is kind of like gone away, and now I'm a bit of a kind of like energy nerd. So I think, although I've enjoyed that part of my life and everything, all roads end up leading to the one place, I think that I would go and say to the then Gillian Taylor, don't turn your nose up at physics and chemistry.
Great.
But buckle in.
So young people stick in at physics and chemistry.
Because the opportunities that those two things would give you are immense. And the life that you could have, I see that from like the people I know in my family that have worked in the energy sector, the potential for the life that you could have going around the world, exporting your knowledge and working in amazing projects, nothing better.
Brilliant. And, talking about people that are great at physics and chemistry, in the last show, we met Maisie Tuttle and Norman Johnson of Kent, the engineering consultancy. And as you know, in each episode, we ask our guests to leave a question for our next guest.
Yes, I know.
Without knowing who they're going to be. And the question that Maisie and Norman left for you was, with the rise of artificial intelligence technology and the progression that they're making, how do you see AI being part of the energy transition? How can it help progress more quickly to cleaner, renewable energy?
I think straight off, I would say that the potential for AI in particularly the marine space and the subsea space, we're talking about offshore wind, would be in safety. We're talking about really hostile environments. I mentioned earlier that I wrote quite a lot of sub-safety courses, and a lot of that was about taking away the human element to getting something done because it was so hazardous. And oil and gas have been very good at that in the innovation of that up to so far, because again, working in potentially dangerous environments in terms of like the weather, but also dealing with explosive elements, hydrocarbons, or whatever. You're still going to have quite a lot of those risks because you're going to be working in offshore environments for ScotWind and all the rest of it. My colleague Richard Lockhead has innovation in his portfolio, and he was at the Robotarium, and he actually heard from there's actually developments taking place where having crewless vessels that are having to go out and do maintenance to things. That's AI, and it's meaning that there's not actually individuals out there in the North Sea, the west of Shetland, at the top of the north of Scotland, where that can be pretty dicey sometimes. So if you're able to take people out of the equation, but you know what? Also, the other aspect of that is that's probably going to make this sector more appealing to young people is you're not out at sea for 3 weeks at a time. You could be doing the same thing, remotely operated, maintaining this and involved in this, but you can go home at night. Absolutely. And I think that would be hugely attractive.
Yeah, and that's what we all need, isn't it? People going home safe every night.
Yeah.
That would be brilliant. That's a great answer, Gillian. Thank you for that. And ahead of recording, I asked if you could please set a question for our next guest. Can you let us know what it is?
Well, without knowing who it is, I think the question that I often ask the people that I meet in this area that are involved in developing energy, how are you going to encourage young people to go into your industry? Sub-question, particularly young women.
That's a good question, yes. And of course, we'll wait and see who's going to answer that one.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. So how do you encourage young people to enter your business and I guess the industry, and especially young women?
Yeah.
Great. Well, we will certainly ask that at the next episode. And of course, we've actually had some pretty inspirational women on the podcast already. And we've got some pretty inspirational women coming up as well. So that's great. It might even be a lady that we ask that of. We shall find out. Just before we sign off, Gillian, how did you hear about the podcast?
I think when I got this job, I suddenly thought, right, I'm going to do lots and lots of homework. And so I sort of like went online and I was up like, Googling best energy podcasts, but UK based, whatever. And that's how. And then I met you.
Yes.
I met you at an event. I think it was an offshore wind.
It was the
event.
Scottish Renewables Marine Conference.
So it was.
That's right.
Yeah. And it just so happened that you had been in the list that Google was throwing up.
Oh,
and I had been dipping in and out of as I was trying vigorously to sort of like try and prepare myself for the new role that I have.
Well, I can tell you I was delighted when we first met, and you not only knew about the podcast, but you'd actually listened to it too, which is great. So fantastic. And look, that brings us to the end of our podcast recording today. And, I'd just like to thank you, Gillian Martin, for joining us today. And I've got to say, in terms of your personal success as Energy Minister, it certainly seems like you're across all of those issues within your portfolio. Excellent.
Thank you. That's lovely feedback. That's put a little smile on my face.
Great. I would like to say thank you to the Global Underwater Hub here in West Hill, Aberdeen, for letting us use their amazing facilities to interview Gillian today. And as always, feedback on today's podcast and recommendations for who our guests should be and what questions we should be asking the leaders of the energy transition would be most welcome. Most of you get in touch through LinkedIn, of course, that's great. If not, send me an email. It's Murray, that's Moray, @annetconsulting.com. And we'll see you in the next episode.